On the quiet edge of a bustling city, under the shadow of crumbling buildings and flickering streetlights, a man lived a life unnoticed by most. His clothes were old and patched, his shoes worn thin, but his spirit carried a warmth that the world often overlooked. He had no house to call his own, no soft bed to rest in, and no family to share his days with. Yet he had something many others seemed to lose in the rush of their lives: kindness. Every evening, just as the sky turned golden and the streets began to empty, he would sit on a small bench in a deserted park. From the pockets of his tattered coat, he would pull out scraps of food he had saved throughout the day. Some were half-eaten sandwiches gifted by strangers, others were leftovers found in the trash bins behind CAFS. He didn't eat much himself, but he always made sure to keep enough for his most loyal companion, a stray dog with fur the color of rust and a wagging tail that seemed to light up even the darkest nights. The dog, who had no name and no collar, seemed to sense the man's goodness. It would trot over from wherever it spent its days, its ears perked and its eyes shining with gratitude. The man would laugh softly, a sound rare in his world, and greet the dog as if they were old friends meeting after years apart. Together, they shared their meager meal, a bond of trust and understanding growing stronger with each passing day. The man often spoke to the dog as if it could understand every word. "Life doesn't give us much, does it, buddy? But at least we have this," he'd say, breaking off a piece of bread and tossing it to the eager canine. The dog would wag its tail in agreement, as if to say, "Yes, this is enough." Though their connection was simple, it stood out in a world where people often hurried past without a glance, lost in their own struggles. The man didn't have much to give, but what he did have, he gave freely. And in return, the dog gave him something priceless: companionship, loyalty, and a reason to keep going when the nights grew cold and the days felt endless. But life, as it often does, had other plans. One evening, as the man waited on his usual bench, the dog didn't come. At first, he thought little of it. Perhaps it had been distracted or found a kind stranger with better food to offer. But when days turned into a week, worry settled in his chest. He searched the alleys, the dumpsters, the hidden corners of the park where the dog sometimes rested. He called out, his voice cracking from both the cold and fear, but there was no sign of his four-legged friend. The absence of the dog left a hollow ache in the man's heart. He realized just how much the creature had come to mean to him, not just as a companion but as a reminder that kindness, even in the smallest forms, could create something beautiful. Without the dog, the world seemed a little colder, the streets a little lonelier. Just as he began to lose hope, something unexpected happened. One evening, while sitting on the same bench, he noticed a faint sound in the distance, a whimper, soft and weak. His heart leapt, and he turned his head, straining to hear it again. There it was, unmistakable and closer this time. He rose to his feet, his breath visible in the chilly night air, and followed the sound. It led him to an abandoned lot overgrown with weeds and strewn with broken glass. There, hidden behind a pile of debris, he found the dog. Its fur was matted, its body thin, and one of its legs was bent at an unnatural angle. The man's heart clenched at the sight, but the dog's tail gave a weak wag, a spark of recognition lighting up its tired eyes. Without hesitation, the man scooped the dog into his arms. It whimpered softly but didn't resist, seeming to understand that it was safe now. "What happened to you, buddy?" the man whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Don't worry. I'll take care of you." He carried the dog through the city streets, past the indifferent eyes of strangers and the bright lights of shops he could never enter. His feet ached, and his arms grew tired, but he didn't stop. Eventually, he found a small, dingy animal clinic tucked away in a corner of the city. The lights inside were dim, and the building looked as worn as he felt, but it was his only hope. Inside, a kind veterinarian took one look at the pair and nodded, understanding the urgency of the situation. The man watched anxiously as the dog was examined, his hands clenched into fists to stop them from trembling. When the vet returned, her face was serious but kind. "The leg is broken, and it's been like that for a while. We'll need to set it, but it's going to take time to heal. The dog also needs proper food and rest. It's malnourished." The man nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He didn't ask about the cost, he had nothing to offer but his determination to see the dog get better. The vet must have sensed this because she said, "We'll figure something out. For now, let's just focus on getting your friend here back on its feet." As the dog was treated, the man sat in the waiting room, his mind racing. He didn't know how he would manage to care for the dog during its recovery, but one thing was clear: he wouldn't abandon it, just as it had never abandoned him. Days turned into weeks, and the man did everything he could to help the dog heal. He begged for scraps from restaurants to feed it, found old blankets to keep it warm, and spent hours talking to it, encouraging it to stay strong. The dog, in turn, seemed to draw strength from the man's unwavering care. Its tail began to wag more often, its eyes grew brighter, and it even managed to hobble a few steps on its mended leg. Their bond, already strong, became unbreakable. People in the neighborhood began to notice the man and his dog, their story spreading quietly but powerfully. Strangers who once ignored him now stopped to offer food or a kind word. Some even left small donations at the park bench where he and the dog often sat, moved by the sight of their companionship. The man didn't care much for the attention, but he was grateful for anything that helped him care for the dog. It wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about proving that love and kindness, even in the face of hardship, could create something extraordinary. Then, one day, something happened that changed everything. While sitting on their usual bench, the man noticed a sleek car pull up nearby. Out stepped a woman, well dressed and confident, but with a softness in her expression that caught his attention. She approached cautiously, her eyes fixed on the dog. "I've been looking for him," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "That dog. He was mine. He went missing months ago. I thought I'd never see him again." The man's heart sank. He looked at the dog, who had been wagging its tail at the woman, but then turned back to him, as if sensing his unease. The bond they had formed was undeniable, and the thought of losing his companion tore at his soul. But before he could speak, the woman knelt down and reached into her bag, pulling out a photograph. It showed the dog, healthy and happy, sitting next to a little boy who looked about 6 years old. "My son," she explained, her voice breaking. "This dog was his best friend. He's been heartbroken without him." The man looked between the woman and the dog, his emotions a storm inside him. He knew what he had to do, but the decision felt like tearing out a piece of his own heart. "Finally," he said softly, "he's yours. He belongs with your family." The woman's eyes filled with tears, and she placed a hand on his arm. "Thank you," she said. "But I can see how much he means to you. We could share him. My son would be happy just to know he's safe and loved. We could work something out." The man stared at her in disbelief, hope sparking where despair had been moments before. For the first time in years, he felt like the world had given him something instead of taking it away. And as the dog wagged its tail, caught between its two humans, the man realized that maybe, just maybe, there was room for a little more kindness in his life. The man sat frozen for a moment, trying to process the woman's words. Share the dog? The idea seemed almost impossible. He had spent so many nights worrying, feeding, and caring for the animal as if it were the only thing in the world that mattered. And yet, looking at the photo in the woman's trembling hands, he saw the bond that had once existed between the dog and the little boy. That same bond now existed between him and the dog, but he couldn't deny the boy's place in the animal's heart. The woman knelt down and reached out her hand slowly, giving the dog a chance to sniff her fingers. The dog hesitated, glancing back at the man as if asking for permission. "Go on, buddy," the man said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. With a tentative wag of its tail, The dog moved closer to the woman, pressing its nose into her hand. Tears filled her eyes as she gently stroked the dog's matted fur. "This must have been so hard for him," she said, her voice breaking. "He's been through so much, but you saved him." She looked up at the man, gratitude written all over her face. "I don't think I can ever repay you for what you've done." The man shook his head, his throat tightening. "You don't owe me anything," he said quietly. "He's a good dog. He deserved to be saved." The woman hesitated, then spoke again, her words measured and careful. "I know this might sound strange, but would you come with me? Meet my son? I think he'd want to thank you too. And we can figure out how this could work." "Sharing him, I mean." The man blinked in surprise. It wasn't just the idea of sharing the dog that caught him off guard, it was the invitation. People didn't usually invite him anywhere. He was the man they avoided on the street, the one they glanced at briefly before looking away. But this woman's offer was genuine, her eyes full of warmth and sincerity. He nodded slowly, unsure of what else to do. "All right," he said, his voice hesitant but steady. They walked together, the woman leading the way to her car. She opened the back door, and the dog hopped in with a surprising burst of energy, its tail wagging as if it understood that something good was happening. The man hesitated for a moment, then climbed into the passenger seat. The drive was quiet, but not uncomfortably so. The woman introduced herself, but the man gave only his first name in return, feeling awkward about revealing too much. As they drove through streets lined with neat houses and manicured lawns, he couldn't help but feel out of place. This was a world so different from his own, a world of stability and comfort, where people didn't have to worry about where their next meal would come from or where they would sleep at night. The car pulled into the driveway of a modest house with a small, well-kept yard. A boy, no older than 7, ran out onto the porch as soon as the car stopped. His eyes lit up when he saw the dog in the back seat. "Max!" the boy shouted, his voice filled with pure joy. The dog's ears perked up at the sound of its old name, and it barked, tail wagging furiously. The boy ran to the car, and the woman quickly opened the door, letting the dog leap out. It was as if no time had passed between them. The boy wrapped his arms around the dog's neck, laughing as the dog licked his face. The man watched from a distance, his heart a confusing mix of emotions. He was happy for the boy, for the dog, for the reunion that seemed so right. But he couldn't ignore the pang of loss that tugged at him, a reminder that he might no longer be the most important person in the dog's life. The woman touched his arm gently, pulling him from his thoughts. "Come inside," she said. "Please." Inside, the house was cozy and inviting. The boy, still holding onto the dog, turned to look at the man. "Thank you," he said earnestly, his small voice filled with gratitude. "Thank you for taking care of Max." The man nodded, feeling a lump in his throat. "He's a good dog," he said simply. As the evening went on, the woman offered him dinner, and though he hesitated at first, hunger eventually won out. They sat together at the table while the boy played with the dog in the living room. The woman asked about his life, careful not to pry too deeply, and he found himself opening up more than he expected. He told her about how he had lost his job years ago, how one bad turn had led to another until he found himself on the streets. He spoke of the loneliness, the judgment, and the constant fight to survive. But he also talked about the dog, how meeting it had changed everything, given him a purpose, and reminded him that even in the hardest times, there was still room for kindness. The woman listened intently, her eyes filled with empathy. "You've been through so much," she said softly. "I can't imagine how hard it must have been. But you didn't let it make you bitter. You chose kindness instead. That's rare." He shrugged, feeling uncomfortable with the praise. "I just did what anyone would do." "No," she said firmly. "Not everyone would. What you did. It matters. It made a difference." As the night went on, the woman proposed a plan. The dog would stay with her and her son for a few days each week, but the man could visit any time he wanted. They would share the responsibility, ensuring that the dog had the care and love it needed. The man agreed, though the arrangement felt strange at first. He wasn't used to relying on others or being part of something that felt like a partnership. But as the days turned into weeks, he began to see the beauty in it. The boy adored the dog, and the man couldn't deny the joy it brought to both of them. He visited often, and each time he saw the dog's wagging tail and the boy's laughter, he felt a little more at peace. The woman, true to her word, made sure the man was always welcome. She even started helping him in small ways, leaving food for him to take when he left and connecting him with local shelters and organizations that could provide support. At first, he resisted, feeling ashamed of his situation, but her kindness was gentle and persistent, and eventually, he accepted. One afternoon, as he sat on the porch with the dog lying at his feet, the boy came up to him, holding a piece of paper. "I drew this for you," he said shyly. The man unfolded the paper to find a drawing of himself and the dog sitting on their park bench. It was simple but full of heart, and for the first time in a long while, he felt tears welling up in his eyes. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. The boy smiled, then ran off to play with the dog. The man looked at the drawing again, feeling something shift inside him. For so long, he had felt invisible, as if the world had forgotten him. But now, sitting here in this small, warm corner of someone else's life, he felt seen. The arrangement wasn't perfect, and the man still faced many challenges. But now, he wasn't entirely alone. He had the dog, the boy, and the woman who had shown him a kindness he hadn't expected. Together, they had created something unique, a shared bond that reminded them all of the power of compassion and connection. And though the future was uncertain, the man found himself holding on to a quiet hope, the kind that felt as steady and unyielding as the wag of a dog's tail. One chilly morning, the man arrived at the house as usual. The dog bounded out to greet him, its tail wagging furiously. The boy followed close behind, laughing as he called for the dog to wait. The scene was one of simple joy, but the man couldn't shake a strange feeling that had settled in his chest. Something felt different off, but he couldn't quite place what it was. The woman stepped outside, her expression warm but slightly distracted. She greeted him, and then hesitated, as if she wanted to say something but wasn't sure how. Before he could ask what was on her mind, she smiled and gestured toward the boy and the dog. "He's been asking about you all morning," she said, her voice light, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. The man nodded, though the sense of unease lingered. He tried to push it aside as the boy ran up to him, excitedly asking if they could all go to the park together. The woman agreed, and soon they were walking down the familiar path toward the open space where the man and the dog had first met. The park was quiet, the early morning air crisp and filled with the sound of leaves crunching underfoot. The boy and the dog ran ahead, chasing each other in playful circles. The man walked alongside the woman, their conversation easy but subdued. He couldn't help but notice how she kept glancing around, her shoulders tense as if she were expecting something or someone. When they reached the bench where the man and the dog had spent so many nights, the boy and the dog collapsed onto the grass nearby, both panting from their game. The woman sat down on the bench, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The man remained standing, his eyes scanning the park instinctively, his years on the streets making him hyper-aware of his surroundings. That was when he saw them. Two men, dressed in dark jackets, standing at the edge of the park. They weren't doing anything overtly suspicious, but they were watching too intently. The man's stomach tightened, his instincts flaring. He turned to the woman, his voice low. "Do you know them?" She followed his gaze, her face paling slightly. She hesitated, then shook her head. "No, I don't think so," she said, but her voice wavered. The man didn't press her, but he couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't telling the whole truth. He watched the men carefully, his body tense as he tried to appear calm for the boy's sake. The dog, sensing his unease, stood up and moved closer to his side, its ears perked and alert. The men didn't approach, but their presence cast a shadow over the once peaceful morning. The woman stood abruptly, her voice tight as she called for the boy. "Come on, sweetie. Let's head home." The boy protested, wanting to stay and play longer, but the urgency in his mother's voice left no room for argument. The man stayed close as they walked back, his eyes constantly flicking over his shoulder. The men didn't follow, but the tension didn't lift. Back at the house, the woman locked the door behind them and drew the curtains, her movements quick and jittery. The boy, sensing her unease, asked what was wrong, but she brushed it off with a forced smile. The man didn't press her, but his own unease had grown into something more, a gut-deep certainty that whatever was going on was far from over. That night, as the man sat on his usual park bench, he couldn't stop thinking about the men in the park and the look on the woman's face. He had seen fear like that before, the kind that came from being watched, from knowing that someone had their eyes on you for reasons you couldn't fully understand. The dog lay at his feet, its head resting on its paws, but its ears twitched at every sound. It, too, seemed on edge, as if it could sense the storm brewing just beyond their reach. The next day, the man returned to the house, hoping to find answers. But when he knocked on the door, there was no response. He tried again, louder this time, but the house remained silent. His heart began to race. He stepped back, glancing around. The curtains were still drawn, and the yard was eerily still. He called out, his voice echoing in the quiet street, but no one came to the door. The dog whined softly at his side, sensing his distress. The man hesitated, then decided to wait. He sat down on the porch steps, his eyes never leaving the door. Hours passed, but no one appeared. As the sun began to set, a neighbor approached, concern etched on her face. "Are you looking for them?" she asked. The man nodded, his stomach tightening. "Yeah." "Have you seen them?" The neighbor hesitated, then shook her head. "They left early this morning. Packed up their car and drove off in a hurry. Didn't say where they were going." The man's heart sank. He tried to thank the neighbor, but his voice felt stuck in his throat. Turning back to the house, he stared at the empty windows, a cold knot of dread settling in his chest. Why had they left so suddenly? And where had they gone? The questions swirled in his mind, each one more urgent than the last. He thought of the men in the park, the woman's fear, the way she had locked the door and drawn the curtains. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, and he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it wasn't over yet. The dog nudged his hand, breaking him out of his thoughts. He looked down at it, its eyes filled with the same quiet determination he felt growing inside him. Whatever had happened, whatever danger the woman and her son were facing, he couldn't just walk away. He stood up, his jaw tightening as he made a silent promise to himself. He would find them. He didn't know how or where to start, but he wouldn't stop until he did. They had given him kindness and trust when no one else had, and now it was his turn to do the same for them. As the night fell and the city lights flickered on, the man and the dog walked away from the empty house, their silhouettes blending into the shadows. The stakes had never been higher, and though the road ahead was uncertain, one thing was clear: this was only the beginning. The man and the dog moved through the quiet streets, the tension growing heavier with each step. He replayed the morning's events in his mind, searching for any clue he might have missed. The woman's fear had been unmistakable, and the neighbor's account only deepened his worry. If they had left in such a rush, it wasn't without reason. Something had forced them to leave, and the man was determined to find out what. As he walked, the dog suddenly stopped, its ears perking up. It growled softly, staring at something in the shadows ahead. The man followed its gaze and saw a figure leaning against a lamppost, barely visible in the dim light. The figure wasn't moving, but the man felt a prickle of unease. The dog's stance was tense, its body low to the ground, ready to act if needed. The man took a deep breath and approached cautiously. The figure straightened as he neared, stepping into the light. It was one of the men from the park. The man froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The stranger's expression was calm, almost too calm, and his voice was low and even when he spoke. "You're looking for them, aren't you?" The man didn't answer immediately, his instincts screaming at him to be cautious. He tightened his grip on the dog's leash, keeping his voice steady. "Who are you? What do you want?" The stranger smirked, his gaze drifting to the dog for a moment before returning to the man. "That's not important. What is important is that you don't get involved. Walk away now, and you won't have to regret it." The man's chest tightened with anger. He had seen threats like this before, people who used fear to control others. But he wasn't the type to back down, especially not now. "I'm not going anywhere until I know they're safe," he said firmly. The stranger's smirk faded, replaced by a cold, calculating look. "Suit yourself," he said, turning to leave. "But don't say I didn't warn you." As the man watched him disappear into the night, his resolve only hardened. Whoever this stranger was, he wasn't acting alone. The man had seen the way the woman looked at those men in the park. She knew them, or at least knew enough to be afraid of them. He spent the rest of the night searching, his mind racing with questions. What had the woman gotten herself into? Why was she running? And why did the men care so much about a homeless man trying to help her and her son? By morning, he was exhausted but no closer to answers. He returned to the park, hoping to find some trace of where they might have gone. As he sat on the familiar bench, the dog sniffed around the area, its nose to the ground. It wasn't long before the dog stopped abruptly, pawing at the earth near a bush. The man hurried over and found a crumpled piece of paper, half buried in the dirt. He unfolded it carefully, his heart racing as he recognized the woman's handwriting. The note was brief, scrawled in haste. "If you find this, please know we're in danger. I didn't want to involve you, but I had no choice. They're watching us. Please keep him safe." The man's stomach dropped. The him she referred to could only mean her son. He clenched the note in his fist, his mind racing. She had left this behind, knowing he might come looking. She trusted him to protect her child, even if she couldn't say it outright. The question now was, who were they? The strangers in the park? The man from the lamppost? Or was there an even larger threat he hadn't yet seen? As he turned the note over, hoping for more clues, he noticed faint markings on the back. It looked like an address, hastily scrawled and barely legible. His pulse quickened. It wasn't much, but it was something, a thread he could follow. The man didn't waste any time. He tucked the note into his pocket and set off, the dog trotting beside him. The address led him to a rundown part of the city, where buildings stood close together and shadows seemed to linger even in broad daylight. The house he was looking for was a small, weathered structure with peeling paint and boarded-up windows. It didn't look like anyone had lived there for years, but the man's instincts told him otherwise. He approached cautiously, his senses on high alert. As he reached the door, he heard a faint sound from inside, a shuffle, like someone moving quietly. He knocked softly, glancing over his shoulder to ensure he wasn't being watched. The door creaked open a crack, and a pair of frightened eyes peeked out. It was the boy. The child's face lit up with recognition, but his expression quickly turned fearful. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered, his voice trembling. The man knelt down to his level, keeping his voice gentle. "It's okay. I'm here to help. Where's your mom?" Before the boy could answer, the door opened wider, and the woman appeared. Her face was pale, her eyes filled with both relief and fear. She pulled the boy back, stepping in front of him protectively. "You shouldn't have come," she said, her voice shaking. "They'll find you too." The man stepped inside quickly, closing the door behind him. "Who are they? What do they want? The woman hesitated, glancing at her son before answering. They're dangerous people. I made a mistake. I trusted the wrong person, and now they're after me. The man's mind raced as he tried to piece together the puzzle. He could see the fear in her eyes, but there was something else, too, regret, as if she blamed herself for everything that had happened. Before he could press for more information, the sound of a car pulling up outside made them all freeze. The woman's face went pale, and the boy clung to her leg, his small body trembling. The man moved to the window, peeking out carefully. A sleek black car had parked in front of the house, and two men stepped out. One of them was the stranger from the lamppost. The woman grabbed the man's arm, her voice urgent. You have to leave. Take him and go. They'll hurt you if they see you here. But the man shook his head. He wasn't going to run, not now, not when the stakes were this high. He turned to the boy, his voice steady. Stay with your mom. I'll take care of this. The boy's eyes filled with tears, but he nodded, his trust in the man unshaken. The man stepped outside, closing the door behind him. The dog followed closely, its body tense and ready. The two men approached, their expressions cold and unyielding. What do you want? The man demanded, his voice firm. The stranger from the lamppost smirked, his eyes narrowing. We want what's ours. You're in the way, old man. Walk away while you still can. But the man didn't flinch. He stood his ground, his determination unwavering. The dog growled low, its stance protective. The tension crackled in the air, the confrontation teetering on the edge of violence. The man knew he was outnumbered and outmatched, but he also knew he couldn't back down. As the two sides faced off, the door behind him creaked open slightly, and he heard the woman's voice, barely a whisper. Be careful. Her words only strengthened his resolve. He had come too far to turn back now, and he wasn't about to let fear dictate his actions. The stakes had never been higher, and the man knew that whatever happened next would change everything. The tension in the air was suffocating as the man stood firm in front of the two strangers. The dog remained by his side, growling softly, its muscles coiled like a spring ready to snap. The men inched closer, their smirks fading into cold, calculating stares. One of them reached into his jacket, his hand emerging with a threatening glint of metal. I'll ask one last time, the stranger said, his voice sharp and deliberate. Step aside and hand over what's ours. You don't want to make this worse for yourself. The man's jaw tightened. His heart raced, but his voice stayed calm. I don't know what you think you're owed, but I do know this, you're not getting past me. The dog barked sharply, a warning that echoed through the quiet street. The sound seemed to unsettle the men, but only for a moment. They exchanged a look, silently deciding their next move. Before either could act, the woman's voice rang out behind him, filled with anger and desperation. Enough! She shouted, stepping out from the doorway. She held a small, worn bag in her hands, clutching it as if it contained something precious. The man turned to her, confusion flashing in his eyes. What are you doing? She didn't meet his gaze, her focus locked on the two strangers. You want this, don't you? This is what all of this has been about. The men's expressions shifted, a flicker of satisfaction passing over their faces. The taller one nodded slowly. Hand it over, and we'll leave you alone. The woman hesitated, her grip on the bag tightening. Her son appeared in the doorway, his small frame trembling. Mom, don't, he pleaded, his voice breaking. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she didn't move. The man placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice low. Whatever's in there, it's not worth your safety or his. She looked at him then, her expression a mixture of fear and determination. You don't understand, she whispered. This bag is the only proof I have. If they get it, they'll destroy it, and everything I've done will be for nothing. The man didn't have time to ask what she meant. The strangers moved closer, their patience clearly running out. The taller one held out his hand. Give it to us, or we'll take it by force. The woman's eyes darted to her son, then back to the man standing protectively in front of her. She made her decision in an instant, thrusting the bag into the man's hands. Run, she said urgently. Get this to someone who can use it. Someone who can stop them. The man hesitated, torn between staying to protect her and doing as she asked. But the look in her eyes left no room for argument. With a nod, he turned and ran, the dogs sprinting alongside him. Shouts erupted behind him as the strangers gave chase. The man's heart pounded in his chest as he zigzagged through the streets, clutching the bag tightly. The dog stayed close, barking fiercely whenever the pursuers got too near. He didn't stop until he reached the train station, the crowded platform providing a temporary refuge. He ducked into a corner, panting heavily as he opened the bag. Inside, he found a stack of documents, photographs, and a small USB drive. His eyes widened as he scanned the papers. They were contracts, financial statements, and correspondence implicating the two men and their organization in a series of illegal activities. It was clear now why they wanted it so badly. This wasn't just about the woman, this was about power, corruption, and control. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The woman had been trying to expose them, and now her life and her son's was at risk because of it. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't go to the police. The documents suggested that the corruption ran deep, possibly even into law enforcement. But he had connections, people he trusted to do the right thing. As he pulled out his phone to make the call, he felt a presence behind him. He turned sharply, only to see the woman standing there, her face pale but determined. How did you? He started, but she cut him off. I couldn't let you do this alone, she said, her voice trembling. They'll keep coming after you. After us. We have to end this together. The man hesitated for only a moment before nodding. Together, they formulated a plan, one that would ensure the evidence reached the right hands while keeping her and her son safe. But as they moved to leave the station, the taller man appeared at the edge of the crowd, his cold eyes locking onto them. The man's heart sank. They were out of time. The dog growled, its stance protective as the stranger approached. But before he could reach them, a commotion broke out behind him. The shorter man was being held by two plainclothes officers, his face a mask of shock. The taller man froze, realizing too late that they had been set up. The woman smiled faintly, her voice calm despite the chaos. I knew you'd come after us. That's why I called them first. The officers moved in, arresting the taller man as the woman handed over the bag of evidence. Relief flooded the man as he realized the ordeal was finally over. But just as they started to leave, the woman turned to him, her expression unreadable. There's something you need to know, she said quietly. This wasn't just about me. It was about you too. Confused, the man waited for her to continue. Her next words left him reeling. They knew about you before we ever met. You weren't just in the wrong place at the wrong time. You were their target all along. The revelation sent a chill down his spine. He opened his mouth to ask what she meant, but before he could speak, the dog barked sharply, pulling his attention to the shadows beyond the platform. Someone was watching them. And the fight, it seemed, was far from over. The man froze, his instincts telling him to stay alert. The dog, always sharp, growled low, its eyes fixed on the figure lurking in the shadows. The woman, still clutching her son's hand tightly, followed the man's gaze, her expression shifting from relief to concern. The platform, once bustling with noise and movement, now felt eerily still, as if the world itself had paused to take a breath. The figure stepped forward, revealing an older man with a weathered face. His eyes, sharp and calculating, carried the weight of someone who had seen far too much. He didn't look like the others, no cold smirk or heavy-handed threats, but his presence carried the same unnerving energy. The man felt his pulse quicken, unsure of what to expect. You've stirred up quite a storm, the older man said, his voice steady but laced with authority. I'm here to make sure it doesn't get worse. The man squared his shoulders, keeping himself between the stranger and the woman. Who are you? The older man raised a hand, as if to show he meant no harm. Let's just say I'm someone who knows the stakes. I've been watching these men for a long time, and I've been waiting for a moment like this. You've done more than you realize. The woman stepped forward, her voice sharp. If you've been watching, why didn't you stop them earlier? Why wait until now? The older man's gaze softened, but there was a sadness behind his words. Because people like me don't act without solid evidence. And until tonight, that's all we had: suspicions, bits of information, but nothing that would hold up under scrutiny. What you handed over changes everything. The man exchanged a glance with the woman, both of them feeling the weight of his words. So, what now? The man asked cautiously. The older man reached into his coat, pulling out a small badge that identified him as a federal investigator. Now we take this to the people who can bring them down for good. The evidence you've gathered isn't just enough to stop these two, it could dismantle the entire operation. But I need your help. The man hesitated, the events of the night catching up with him. His life had already been turned upside down, and now he was being asked to take an even greater risk. But when he looked at the woman and her son, he felt a sense of purpose stronger than his fear. He nodded. Tell us what we need to do. The next few hours were a blur of coordination and planning. The investigator guided them through every step, ensuring the evidence would reach the right hands without interference. The man and the woman, though exhausted, worked tirelessly, their shared determination driving them forward. The dog, ever faithful, stayed by their side, a silent guardian through the chaos. As dawn broke, painting the city in soft hues of orange and pink, the final pieces of the plan fell into place. The evidence was handed off securely, and the investigator promised to follow through on his end. He looked at the man and the woman with a rare smile. You've done more than you know. This isn't just about stopping a few bad people, it's about giving others the courage to stand up and fight back. The man nodded, feeling a mix of pride and relief. But as the investigator left, the weight of everything they had endured settled heavily on his shoulders. He turned to the woman, unsure of what to say. She smiled faintly, her own exhaustion evident. Thank you, she said simply. For everything. He shook his head. I didn't do it alone. You were the brave one. Her eyes softened as she glanced down at her son, who was now asleep, leaning against her side. I just did what any mother would do. The man didn't argue. Instead, he reached down to pat the dog, who wagged its tail weakly, clearly as tired as they were. Looks like we all need a break. The woman laughed softly, the sound a welcome relief after the tension of the night. I think that's the first time I've laughed in weeks. They stood there for a moment, basking in the calm that had finally come. The streets were beginning to wake up, the hum of life returning to the city. The man looked at the woman and her son, a thought crossing his mind. What will you do now? She hesitated, her expression uncertain. I don't know. We've been running for so long, it's hard to imagine what it's like to stop. The man considered this, then offered a tentative smile. Maybe it's time to find out. You've got a lot of people on your side now, and I think you've earned a little peace. The woman nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Maybe you're right. They said their goodbyes not long after, the woman promising to stay in touch once she found a safe place to start over. The man watched them go, the dog at his side, and felt an unexpected pang of loneliness. But it was quickly replaced by a sense of accomplishment. He had done something good, something that mattered. In the days that followed, news of the arrests and the investigation broke across every major outlet. The organization's corruption was laid bare for the world to see, and people began to speak out, emboldened by the courage of those who had taken the first step. The man watched it all unfold from a distance, content to let the spotlight fall elsewhere. One evening, as he sat on the steps of his makeshift shelter, the dog resting at his feet, a familiar voice called out to him. He looked up to see the woman and her son standing there, both looking healthier and happier than he'd last seen them. "We couldn't stay away," she said with a smile. "We wanted to thank you properly." The man stood, his heart lifting at the sight of them. "You don't owe me anything." The boy ran forward, throwing his arms around the dog, who wagged its tail enthusiastically. The woman stepped closer, her expression warm. "Maybe not. But we wanted to let you know we're okay. And that we haven't forgotten what you did for us." The man felt a lump in his throat as he looked at them. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of belonging, a connection that went beyond words. "I'm just glad you're safe." The woman reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "And we want you to be safe too. You don't have to do this alone anymore." The man smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that felt like the first in years. He looked at the boy, now playing with the dog, and then back at the woman. "Maybe it's time for me to stop running too." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the city in a golden glow, they sat together, sharing stories and laughter. For the first time, the man felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. And as the dog rested its head on his lap, he realized that sometimes, even the smallest acts of kindness could lead to the most profound changes. The streets might still be unpredictable, but with the people beside him, he knew he could face whatever came next. Together, they were no longer just surviving, they were living. And that, he thought, was the greatest victory of all.